Okay, we are in for a long video. And a painful one at that too. So, here's the thing. So, as we know, 2022 will be a confusing midterm election cycle. So, I want to point out, and I know I'm on my computer, so I can't show you evidence that will require that, but I want to point out, where do I think my money is going to go for the elections? And it really is unfortunate. Now, I personally think that Republicans will have a slight success. And it's hard to see why with Biden being disapproved of by 12%, but a generic ballot only shows Republicans up by 2.6% on their own accords. And here's why. The reason why is because a lot of Democrats disapprove of Biden, but wouldn't vote for a Republican at the same time. If you think about it, on Election Day, Trump was down by about 7%, but in the popular vote only lost by about 4.5%. So people were disapproving of Trump, yet still voted for him. And in Biden's case, it's more extreme because of the polarization. So people are disapproving of Biden, but would still be unwilling to vote for a Republican candidate. Republicans would want their lead to be better, and this happened in the inroads because the Democrats were never up 19% on the generic ballot, even when Biden was approved of by 19%. So you kind of have to look at it in that perspective as well. So where do I think that the midterm elections will go? So, do I think Republicans will pick up the Senate? Republicans in the Senate have had a rocky history, to say the least. In the Senate, it traditionally flips slower than the House, though that isn't always true. So, Republicans haven't had a supermajority in the Senate since the 19th century. Supermajority not meaning filibuster-proof majority, but an actual two-thirds majority. Democrats had this last in 1964. Typically, Senate majorities are closer than House majorities because, again, only 1/3 of the seats are up for election at any given time. Only 1/3. As a matter of fact, had the filibuster existed in 1920, which I'm not sure if it did, or maybe it required a two-thirds majority back then, but when it existed back then, two-thirds majority, in 1920, that's the last time that they had it, with a 59-37 majority. Republicans would lose 7 seats in the 1922 midterms, and they would never, from that point ever on, ever see 59 seats in the Senate ever again. They would have a 56-39 majority in 1928, and from there, the most Senate seats that they would ever have is 55. Democrats having at least 45 seats from that point going forward, because there were some new states added in and whatnot. But Democrats have enjoyed majorities at points leading to 77-15 in the 1930s, after 1936. But even then, their majorities were still quite strong. And you could always see that the Senate would always lag behind the House in terms of adjusting, because again, of the seats that are up. So in some cases, you really can't have it where, like for example, in the 1932 blue wave, it went from a 48-47 Republican Senate to, I believe, something that is 58-37 Democrat Senate. And in the House, the Democrats flipped nearly 100 seats and went from it being a very slight Democratic majority to a big Democratic supermajority. That didn't happen in the Senate until 1934, but when, they did get it, the Democrats managed to hold it until 1942, whereas in the House in 1938, that's when the supermajority in the House kind of busted, because again, of the maps and of this lagging behind situation, meaning that you could always flip the House, But if a Senate majority has gotten really big, in some cases it's actually impossible to flip the Senate in that election cycle, no matter how well you do. So, moving on forward, we know from 1954 to 1980, Republicans did not take control of the House. Then they did for 6 years, Democrats had for 8 years. Then they had it for 6 years, Democrats for 2, then them back for 4. It was confusing. But in 2014, we know that Republicans managed to flip the House for the first time in 8 years, with Mitch McConnell as the Senate Majority Leader. And the map which 2020 had where they lost the Senate was actually the exact same map, but if played out that same way, Republicans would have had a majority. It's actually really a bunch of unfortunate circumstances as to why the Republicans lost the House. Now, I am generally somewhat centrist, but for some reason I don't like trifectas, so I do find it as an unfortunate circumstance. I probably would have said the same thing had Democrats been in the situation Republicans were in. Essentially, what happened was that in 2014, before the elections, Democrats had a 55 to 45 majority. They got this because of such a landslide result in 2008, where they were able to go from their 51 to 49 majority, where they barely even had a majority, given how close some of the elections in Virginia and Montana were, 51 to 49 majority, and they were able to bolster that to a 59 to 41 majority. Then, a senator defected, making it 60-40, but they flipped the seat in a special election in Massachusetts, putting it back to 59 to 41. Then, the 2010 red wave happened, but because Democrats were so far up, and the map wasn't the best for Republicans, it only got to 53 to 47. 2012 comes around, and they flipped 2 seats, including the special election in Massachusetts, where they flipped a net of 2 seats, actually, 55 to 45. But in this 2014 election, Democrats lose 9 seats. A lot of them were actually not reversions of the 2008 election. For instance, they held Oregon, they held New Mexico, they held New Hampshire, they held Minnesota. Minnesota was actually extremely contested in 2008, in case you were not aware of that. They held, not sure what else flipped in 2008. Not sure what else flipped in 2008. Kind of drawing a blank. I know that the Republicans did flip Colorado, North Carolina, and Alaska back to the Republican column, but most of their flips were actually historical flips, seats that should have flipped a long time ago, but that the Democrats have just gotten lucky in which case they, wouldn't be so lucky in 2014. For instance, a seat in South Dakota, this seat that was actually extremely contentious in 2002, with Tim Johnson. Well, unfortunately for Democrats, Tim Johnson was retiring and South Dakota was a solid Republican state. Polarization was increasing. Republicans easily picked up the seat. Oh, Virginia was another seat that the Democrats held. They only narrowly held in 2014, though. I want to make it clear, it was a very close election. So Larry Pressler out, South Dakota flips back to being in the Republican column. Another state that flips is the state of Arkansas. Arkansas was a long-standing Democratic state, but the, legislative and governor and all of those elections, they kind of lagged behind. No more in 2014, and Arkansas will probably never see anything Democratic ever again. It just won't. Arkansas has been violently lost to Democrats, and a lot of it just over the last 10 years or so. But anyway, 2014 they would lose Louisiana. They would lose which did have an incumbent running. They lost West Virginia. So yeah, So yeah, 8 years ago, West Virginia actually had 2 Democratic senators, despite being one of the most Republican states in the country. They lost a couple of other states. Drawing a blank as to what. The Republicans picked up 9 seats. Now, 2016, it does narrow down to 52 to 48. And in a 2017 special election in Alabama, mainly because the Republican was engaged in child molestation, Democrats flipped the seat by 1.6%. So, Doug Jones manages to win that race. Though, as we know, he does not hold it at all in 2020. But it's 51 to 49. Republicans pick up 2 seats in 2018, so it goes to 53 to 47. But 2020 comes. While Republicans flip back Alabama, they lose both of the Georgia races that are up. One of them is special. They lose the Arizona special election, and they lose in Colorado, 50 to 50. It initially appeared it would go into being with a Republican majority, but some of the Democrats' wins, especially in the Georgia elections, it wasn't really so much so expected that this would happen. Because, well, yes, both of the Democrats are favored to win, kind of basing it off of a comparative basis. If both of them have a 60% chance of winning, because Democrats need to win both, their chance of flipping the Senate would actually only be 36% when you think of it in that manner. So, you think about it, you really need to have a 70% chance of one thing to happen in order for both things to happen to pan out correctly. But that is what happened. So, Democrats have a Senate majority, but only by 1 seat. Was actually exactly what was in 2000, except the Republicans had a majority. But it only held out for 4.5 months because then a senator from Vermont flipped, making it 51 to 49 in favor of the Democrats. So, in this case, that didn't happen because while Manchin might have flipped, Trump lashed out against him, and this is an example where you can see of Trump's negative impacts on the Republican Party. Now Manchin is refusing to flip at all, unless Trump apologizes, and as we know, Trump will not apologize. So in 2022, can Republicans pick up the Senate? Well, I'm not sure about this, because Republicans have had a bit of bad luck. Dr. Oz in the Senate for Pennsylvania has backed out, with Conor Lamb being popular, and he's also, shown that Trump could win by 20%. He still won it in a special election, and he was able to convert the district that he lives in Western Pennsylvania, to a Democratic one. Conor Lamb is running for the Senate, and I think that he actually has a decent shot of winning, even in a pro-Republican leading environment. And with Dr. Oz having dropped out, there isn't a clear frontrunner. That is actually one of the big problems the GOP is having. They're lacking frontrunners. They're lacking candidates who will run. So with that, I think Pennsylvania, because the incumbent Pat Toomey is retiring, Pennsylvania, I think, not in my opinion, because I'm actually making an official prediction, Pennsylvania will probably tilt Democrat. Conor Lamb will probably have a very close win, closer than Pat Toomey's re-election in 2016, which came down to just 1.5%, but nonetheless a win for Democrats. Now, what about the state of Wisconsin? Well, with Ron Johnson running, he might be very Trumpy in a state where, as we know, Trump recently lost. Biden got 49.45% of the vote here, and while it doesn't automatically preclude a Trump victory, Trump only managed to get 48.82% of the vote here. But Johnson probably going to run against Ross Feingold, but given a pro-Republican leaning environment, I think the seat will lean Republican. It's not out of the question for Democrats, and they certainly have a very powerful Democrat frontrunner. I even watched one of the ads. Not that it matters, because I don't live in Wisconsin, but again, And I'm only really going to focus on the swing states. While I saw a poll that Murray's only up 9%, that would still be a likely Democratic seat. And I'm not going to focus on Washington for right now unless more polls indicate that it could be a swing seat. Some of the less consequential ones, and I'm actually only going to briefly touch up on. Now, as far as what about other states? I think that North Carolina will probably be a likely margin of victory. I think probably they'll be able to win by about 5 to 7%. Yes, Richard Burr's retiring, but they have a pro-Republican environment, a state that hasn't voted in a Democrat in a statewide election, minus the governorship, since 2008. When Democrats won both the presidential and Senate elections. But in 2012, the state votes for Romney, and in 2014, they elect a Republican senator. So it doesn't really mean too much. And 2008 was a very strong blue wave year, arguably, especially in some states, the strongest blue wave since the 1970s or even 1960s. So I'm not too inclined to really say, my fingers are turning purple. I'm not too inclined to say that Democrats have too much of a chance. Now in the state of Nevada, who do I think is going to win? I've thought about it, and I think it's actually going to tilt Democrat. Here's why. All the polls are indicating Nevada will flip to Republican. But polls in Nevada have had a history of overestimating Republican support. These polls thought that Trump would win the 2016 presidential election in Nevada, when in reality, Trump only gets about 45.5% of the votes. Clinton gets 47.92% of the votes, enough to declare her the victor. In 2018, they thought that both the Senate election and the governor election would flip. And in both cases, well, actually not flip, would remain Republican. In both cases, Democrats flipped both of the seats. So, I'm not too trusting of the polls here in Nevada. I do think that the Catherine Cortez Masto will be able to hold a seat, but I don't think it'll be easy. Adam Laxalt is a strong opponent, and I think that Adam Laxalt has a chance. But I think that his chance at the same time is also a bit limited. So I'm inclined to say that yes. Catherine Cortez Masto will win. So right now it appears to be 51-49 for Democrats, with their flip in Pennsylvania. Now, what about Arizona? Arizona, I'm a bit reluctant to call, but I would also say this probably tilt Democrat. Republicans really do lack a strong frontrunner, and a competitive primary can be their downfall in an election. You need a clear frontrunner in order to just accurately say that they will be able to win, because a very competitive primary can drain their funds, and Democrats are all united against Mark Kelly. Mark Kelly is popular amongst Republicans too, because when Trump lost Arizona by 0.3%, Kelly was able to win by 2.4%. And if Republicans nominate Doug Ducey, Trump will endorse Mark Kelly, which would likely lead to a pretty landslide victory for him. I don't think that the Arizona Republicans are going to nominate Ducey as a result, but we just have to see with that. New Hampshire, I think, will actually be a lean Democrat state, with them lacking any kind of strong candidates. They lack Sununu, they lack Ayotte, they lack Brown. I don't think Ayotte and Brown would have been able to win, but they would have had a chance. Donald Bullock has no chance. Sununu probably would have been able to win by about 8%. Ayotte probably would have lost by about 1%, so that's pretty easily flippable. Brown probably would have lost by about 6% or so. I don't know. I'm just really good percentages. I really never heard Brown be a serious candidate. or not serious candidate, one who is very likely to run at all. That's what I meant to say. And with Hogan declining to run in Maryland, we really don't have too much of a chance of Maryland flipping either. Hogan could have definitely nailed up the race, and we would have to see what the polls would say. He could have potentially even flipped it and ousted Chris Von Hollen, but Hogan has declined to run, which means Maryland isn't flipping. As we know, in 2014, Hogan managed to flip this race by about 3%. He held it in 2018 by 12%. So I think that Larry Hogan, if he had decided to run, could have. But with him choosing not to, I don't think that they have too much of a realistic chance. And Vermont, Patrick Leahy is retiring, but Scott Brown has promised not to run. He is the governor of Vermont, and he wins by landslides there. He won by 40% in 2020, in spite of the fact that Vermont voted for Biden on the same ballot by 35%. But I don't know if he could have run because it would have narrowed up. That being said, he is a type of Republican who could get elected in Vermont, who could win amongst enough Democrats in such a strong Democrat state to make it narrowly flip over. But if he's not choosing to do so, even with an open seat, I don't think that there's any realistic chance of Vermont flipping. So I wanted to clear that out of the way in case you're wondering about the what about Hogan, what about Scott stuff. Well, if they aren't running, then they aren't running, and there's really no realistic probability of either of these seats flipping. And because I really want to get onto other stuff, and I'm going to do Georgia, and then I'm going to go over the governorship and House elections, because this has probably been pretty dreadful for you, if you're even watching. But in Georgia, I think that this will be Republicans' pickup. I think it will tilt Republican. Yeah, Herschel Walker might have domestic violence issues, but in the end, Trump doesn't care about that. We know that Trump still endorsed Roy Moore. It's because the Alabama Republican Party themselves went out against Roy Moore and said, vote for Doug Jones. In 3 years, we can flip this seat back, which they did. But I don't see this happening because, number one, this would be a 6-year flip, not a 3-year flip. So the impacts will remain strong until 2028. And it's true, Warnock is approved of by 7% in Georgia, but Walker is approved of by 11%. People in Georgia simply don't care, and he's a strong candidate. Without him, they would lack a clear front runner. I think that it will certainly be a very competitive race, but for some reason I have this inclination to believe, but this would still preserve the status quo of 50-50. This would actually allow a very slight Democratic majority, and while it would certainly be contested, I am finding it hard to believe that this could actually happen. So, anyway, what about the House? Do I think the House will flip? Well, it's currently 222 to 213. Redistricting so far has not been on the side of the Republicans, and Democrats have actually been able to flip 3 seats. This is due to egregious gerrymanders, such as New York, where Democrats essentially made it so that obviously there was one Republican seat that was being taken away. That was obviously a Republican one. Obviously a Republican one. Then they made it so that they would convert a Republican leaning seat to Democratic leaning seats. Actually did this 3 times. And then they made the 2 already existing toss-ups already held by Democrats, and they made them a lot safer for these Democrats. If in a Republican plus 4 district, Delgado can win by 12%, when Biden can only win by 1.5%. Imagine what he can do in a Democrat plus 4 district. And Maloney, too, goes from even to Democrat plus 3, and he also wins by more than 10%. The 2 of the seats that they converted to Republican were retiring incumbents, Zeldin and Kotko. And Kotko's seat was actually a Democrat plus 4 toss-up where it probably would have flipped blue when he retired, but now it's Democrat plus 13. I think that's part of the reason why they chose to gerrymander a seat. And Nicole Matalokis, whose seat goes from Republican plus 13 to Democrat plus 7, is probably the only incumbent getting ousted. But of course, do Democrats care? They don't care. And New York's have obviously sued, but with all these judges being liberals, I don't think it's going to be able to go, because the thing is that it violates the Constitution according to Republicans, but Democrats argue it won't. And of course, the Constitution is open to interpretation. In Illinois, we saw that and in Oregon too, that these ridiculous gerrymanders have been upheld in court. Of course, Republicans have had their maps overturned in states like Ohio and North Carolina. But Republicans have not been able to overturn Democratic gerrymanders. And as much as they would like to do it in federal court, it's very likely to fail because they don't have the authority to overturn said gerrymanders. The Supreme Court announced that they will not be reversing Ohio and North Carolina because even though, yes, they overturned Alabama was in federal court to begin with because, let's be fair, they had no chance in a state court in Alabama. And there's definitely been an extreme gerrymander in a lot of these states, but Democrats are just finding it easier to have them be upheld. And in Kansas, they've been sued too, and they're probably going to make a map where it won't automatically become, in this new map, it would have probably become 4-0. They probably have to make it so that doesn't happen. And these gerrymanders are, are going to allow Democrats to have 3 seats. So think about it at 225 to 210 current perspective. You will now see about how many they have to flip, because it would probably be 225 to 210 under this map. Now, of course, some states still have to draw, and a state like Florida could determine it, but that sort of thing. Now, as for the final thing, the governorship elections, I think Kansas will flip back red. I think that, Pennsylvania I'm really not sure on. I do think that the Republicans will be able to hold Georgia. Wisconsin could really go either way. I think Democrats are pretty much guaranteed to flip Maryland and Massachusetts, given the Republican incumbents who either have to resign or are choosing to retire. And it's just really on those lines. So, again, I guess I'm just really going into mad ramblings here. What I'm trying to say is that predicting 2022 is very hard, and yeah.